And now, it's time for another Dice Tower review with Tom Vasel.
One of the great benefits I find of historical games is that they actually teach you a little bit about history, sometimes about parts of history you don't know much about, and such is the case of Dos de Mayo, which is a two-player war game, although it doesn't really feel much like a war game, but we'll talk about that more in a minute. But this is about the rebellion of the Spanish against Napoleon in 1808, and it's actually quite interesting. The story in the beginning of the rules explaining what happened prompted me to learn more about it because I didn't know much. I had seen this painting on the front of the box before, but I didn't know much about the game. The game is a two-player game, and it's actually very well designed, representing the Spanish revolting against Napoleon's forces in Madrid, and basically their struggle just to survive in this rebellion. Let's look at the board. Your first reaction here might be that the board looks a little lopsided, and indeed it is. The red forces, the red cubes are Spanish forces, the blue are French. And you can see that the forces in the city are about equal, but there are large forces of French units that are positioned outside of each of 4 city gates. And the city is divided up into 21 different districts, and players will be using their pieces and moving from one district to another. Now the game is going to take place using just these cubes. There's a turn card over here, and we'll be using another cube to mark what turn it is, and there's 10 turns in the game. And then each player also has a deck of cards, and at the beginning of each turn, players start with one of these cards if they choose to. The game actually has an interesting mechanic in which if one player has 3 or more cards than the other player, the player who has more cards can't draw any. So there is the possibility of not drawing these special cards, hoping to keep your opponent from drawing them, but I don't really see a whole lot of usefulness in that. But still, there's specific cards that players can start with on their turn, but as the game progresses, other than that, cards drawn are random. So at the beginning of each turn, players can draw one card if they want to, and then after that, they're going to write down the orders for their forces. There's a sheet that's included with the game, which can be photocopied, or you can just write on a regular sheet of paper. The Spanish forces will write an order for all of their units. The French can only move 2 groups, unless, if you can see right here, there's 3 different sections, which are street sections. Any forces which are moving out of those streets or from those streets, they can move those for free, but everything else, they can only move 2 groups. They can split their groups, while the Spanish player cannot split his groups. After that, after players move their groups, the orders are revealed. We see where the forces go. And then depending on if there are more than one group in the same thing, there's a battle. And the battle is pretty much general combat. If there's a tie between the forces, nothing happens. If it's 2-to-1, you'll destroy 1 cube. I mean, if you have a majority, you destroy 1 cube. If you have a 2-to-1 advantage, you'll destroy 2. A 3-to-1 advantage, you destroy 3 cubes, and so on and so forth. This goes on for 10 turns. The French player can also bring in these forces into the city as one of their moves, and then once those forces are in the city, they can run all over the place. When in combat, the Spanish player can run from combat, but they have to leave half their forces behind. The French player, when they're involved in combat, can never run. The Spanish player, to win, has to accomplish 3 things. 1, survive. All his forces have to be around after 10 turns. 2, he must stop the French player from controlling the 4 districts at the gates. As long as the French player does not control those 4 districts, the Spanish player can win. And 3rd, the Spanish player has to kill at least 4 blue cubes. And there are some cards that maybe will make that requirement 3 blue cubes. And that's basically the game. It's a very simple game, a lopsided game to some degree, but it's a lot more fair and balanced than it might seem. The idea of writing orders down isn't something new. I mean, it's been out in diplomacy for quite a long time. And while diplomacy, sometimes that agony there of making sure your order matches someone else, this is much more interesting because you're trying to outmaneuver your opponent. The Spanish person is basically fighting for their life, just trying to survive. Take out a few French units, but really there's no way to defeat the French. I would say it's impossible, not even remotely possible. They're just trying to win the game by surviving. Reminds me a little bit of Japan and Axis and Allies Pacific. There's no way they can win. They just try to survive. Same thing here. The French player, though, while it looks like you held everything, I mean, you got powerful cards, you got powerful forces, can you just sweep the board? But you only have 10 turns to do so. And a few missteps and the Spanish will win. In fact, some people feel that the Spanish actually have an advantage, and I'm they might, but a poor player will lose with them. And I think it comes out fairly balanced overall. The idea of using cubes for the forces is not a bad one. In this game, it's kind of abstracted anyway. To use miniatures or something doesn't really seem like it would matter much. The other components, the cards themselves have Spanish and English on them, which isn't bad, but there is a lot of text, and you'll find yourself perusing over these cards quite a bit, trying to figure out exactly what they mean. It does add historical flavor to the game, but there's a lot of stuff on them, and it's not always clear exactly what they do until you play the game a few times. Once you play the game, you'll know what cards are in play. You'll know what cards your opponent has because there's only so many cards. And the game isn't card-driven, but skillful use of cards will win or lose you the game. You need to know when to play a card that stops one group from moving. You need to know when you want to move a group twice, which you normally can't do. The Spanish player desperately wants to get a card into play that changes his victory condition slightly, or lets him bring these extra 2 red cubes that are set aside into the fray, because every cube counts during this game. And it's a really well-balanced game. It takes about 25 minutes to play, and it has a lot of replayability. The scenario is always the same, but the way you play and react, and sometimes the game comes down to guesswork. Is he going to move there? Is he going to move there? And knowing what your opponent do makes the game that much more interesting. So this is a refreshing, a new type of game, at least for this year, and I was very impressed with it. Dos de Mayo, and I highly recommend it.
Thanks for joining us today. For more written, audio, and video reviews, as well as the #1 board game podcast, check out the website at www.thedicetower.com. Until then, this is Eric Summerer, and you've been watching The Dice Tower.